Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And here we've got another round of class updates and class tuning. I was starting to wonder if there was going to be any class tuning with the AWC Arena tournaments, the MDI Dungeon tournaments coming up. Because it has been getting so close to those events, I was curious if they were happy with where things were settling for the meta and not wanting to disrupt the competition potentially by making any changes, or if they were going to hold off. But right now, there's a round of changes that have come through. These changes are likely targeted mostly for PvE, although they do assist in PvP for some specializations that are lacking there as well. These round of changes overall, I think, are helpful to those specializations, but I think for a lot of players, when they look at these changes, they're thinking, how did they not nerf anything in PvP? With how crazy the burst damage is on cooldowns at the moment. So if you're expecting these changes to be addressing that, it really isn't. But looking at the changes specifically, Blood Death Knight is getting more armor from their Bone Shield to increase their durability overall and increase their competitiveness. Again, likely focused at PvE, as you're not seeing Blood Death Knight a whole ton in PvP. Frost Death Knight is now also getting 2% increased damage while wielding two-handed weapons. So despite, all those nerfs throughout the beta and everything leading up to the launch of the game to two-handed Frost Death Knight, you're getting a 2% buff in PvE, likely to help you out a little bit. I feel like you're still going to struggle to compete with Unholy in PvE, but in PvP, 2% is pretty good. Frost Death Knight set up with melee cleaves and this coordinated one shot is actually finding a place in the meta, so you'll be pretty happy with even just 2% damage. Frost Mage gets a substantial buff to 9% increased damage. This is likely targeted at raid, but will affect the specialization as a whole across PvP and Mythic Plus. Now, Frostmage was also a spec that received a ton of nerfs towards its conduits leading up to the launch of Shadowlands and throughout, so it kind of fell off pretty hard. This 9% I think is going to be welcomed by anybody wanting to play Frostmage specifically in all content, because it was really suffering in raid specifically. Had a niche in Mythic Plus, and then in PvP, basically if you're not fire, you don't really exist. So this 9% could likely put Frostmage in a spot in PvP where I don't think it's going to be the Rogue Mage spec, but it could be a spellcaster specialization, dragging fights on into dampening, focusing on snaring targets and just doing damage, which I think a lot of Frostmage players in PvP, from my assessment of watching streams and looking at it, I don't feel like mages want to be this tanky dampening specialization, but Frostmage just consistently ends up in that spot. And I think with this 9% buff is that it will be in that niche. You may be more competitive, but you're so far behind in terms of what the meta is at the moment, which is activating a really powerful cooldown that allows you to kill a target in less than 1 second. And if you don't have access to a mechanic like that, you are inferior to the specializations that do, because the game will end if you're facing a spec that can do that and you can't. So maybe we see potential Wizard Cleaves in PvP. In Rage, you're pretty happy to see this. Will 9% be enough? You're pretty far behind. I'm curious to see how it plays out. For Windwalker and Brewmaster, you're getting 2% increased damage while wielding a two-handed weapon, so there's likely some balance issues between dual wielding and two-handers, so wanting to even that out specifically. With the dual wielding components, so an interesting change there overall. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact, although a lot of people, at least in PvP, are probably thinking, wait, they buffed Windwalker, but I don't think that this is really going to change too much. Now for rogues, Assassination now is also receiving an 8% increase in damage. This is likely targeted again at the game as a whole, competing with Outlaw in Mythic Plus or at AoE, or competing with Subtlety at single target in PvE is it's not really possible for Assassination, so it's going to always lack there. 8% overall is going to put it in a bit of a better spot, and right now Assassination currently does have one specific build towards Envenom, and one-shotting somebody with Vanish, with the Legendary providing you 100% crit, and then landing a huge Envenom hit in PvP, but you can do that so infrequently compared to Subtlety that I think it is unlikely an 8% damage buff will really be enough for Assassination and PvP specifically to take over what subtlety is at the moment, even with subtlety being nerfed so heavily in that recent round of changes. So in PvP, I think it's still a subtlety meta. What compositions could an 8% damage buff allow assassination to shine? It would have to be something like a Shadow Priest or a Warlock, maybe. But I still don't think assassination provides the protection that a Warlock would need or a Shadow Priest would need with the current high amount of damage. That assassination is really going to fit anywhere. It's basically just going to be the weaker version of sub. You're going to provide the same role of the Subtlety Rogue, but stunning less frequently and doing less burst as frequently as Subtlety in PvP. And then in PvE, 8% might be enough to start competing with Subtlety on single target. Might. I think that you'll never be able to out damage Blade Flurry, though, even with 8%. So as far as Mythic Plus, 8% probably not enough for assassination, but still buffing the underrepresented specs, I think is a nice change overall from their approach, from nerfing the top down, which is great from these changes overall. For Warrior, Fury is now getting an 8% damage increase, except Bladestorm and Dragon Roar, likely not wanting to affect their burst AoE as a strength for Fury, but overall their damage has been lackluster. But now their Meat Cleaver talent increases the damage only by 25%, down from 30. So again, trying to focus down their cleave. They don't want their cleave getting out of control, but maybe their single target is lacking, would be my assessment. I haven't been playing a lot of Fury, admittedly, and this is just an assessment from looking at the patch notes, but 8% is going to be greeted wholeheartedly. I feel like Fury Warrior has gotten stimulus package after stimulus package of 5% buffs, 8% buffs, and it still just doesn't get there. I wish that I knew more about Fury, honestly, to say what they could do to help it out, because I don't know, man. Like, this spec gets buffed every patch, I swear, and it still doesn't exist in anything in the game. It's not good, not a great dueler, not a great 2v2, 3v3, Mythic Plus maybe with some AoE. But Arms Warrior got a lot of buffs up recently as well. So Fury Warrior, you're happy to see it. I still don't think it's really going to change your position, though, in too much. Maybe PvE, where my knowledge of it is even lesser. But in PvP, an 8% is still not going to give you sort of this role define. Right now, what Fury Warrior would need to work in PvP is the old school Siege Breaker that just killed somebody in one hit from Warlords of Draenor, or the old Odin's Fury that just allowed you to one-tap people, because right now it just doesn't have a hard-hitting cooldown that KOs somebody that every other spec has that's competitive at the moment, would be my assessment of what Fury needs to be viable, assuming that the meta that we've currently got remains the same meta moving forward. It has its pros and it has its cons. It's certainly better than the 80% dampening, infinite mana, never-ending matches that we had in BFA. It's certainly better than that, but it comes with its own cons as well. Now, for PvP specifically, they're looking at the pod tender. I would have liked to have seen more changes around the pod tender. I don't know if it's just too difficult to iterate on, or they don't have time to iterate on it with everything that's going on, or what's going on with it. But this one in particular made a lot of sense, because I even noticed this in my rated BG the other night. If somebody was holding an objective like an orb or a flag and they died and it turned into a pod, the pod kept holding it. That seemed really broken. So that specifically is no longer going to function. But I feel like making the health bar smaller, or maybe have a different look than the rest of the health bars in the game, something unique to it that makes it a bit easier to notice, maybe a circle around it, because right now when it dies, it's a very hard mechanic, and a lot of people, I think, are just downloading weak auras that pop a giant text file in the middle of your screen and you make a macro to target it. It's very not interactive with the game. I think just a couple of visual changes, relocation of the health bar, and then the pod tender will make a lot more sense. I would have liked to have seen some other changes as well to the pod tender, where we don't need to have cooldowns used on it. Like, you shouldn't be able to use a paladin sacrifice on a pod, or rapture powered shields, or pain suppression. I think allies being able to target the pod with cooldowns is way too strong in PvP. Again, maybe this is conflicting with how it works in PvE. Maybe any PvE players out there that are actually actively running Pod Tender can tell me if that's a problem, because I would like to know, and I honestly don't. If Pod Tender is like really meta and it needs to have cooldowns used on it, and you need to be able to heal the pod for it to work in PvE, I feel like Pod Tender is something that people don't ever take in PvE. That's my guess here, because I feel like Naya's mastery buff is better than Pod Tender at the moment for PvE. For anyone that's playing Night Fae or any specs that are playing Night Fae. So I feel like this Pod Tender literally only exists to be used in PvP, which means that in my mind, it should be balanced and function to work appropriately in PvP if it's never going to be picked in PvE, which would be you don't heal it, you don't use defensive cooldowns on it. You can protect it by crowd controlling enemy attackers off the pod or something, but it has a set amount of health. That health gets knocked out, it's over. I think simplifying it, making it easier to see, would be better for the game. And if I'm wrong there, and it's used in PvE, and you need to be able to use cooldowns on it, and it's very important in PvE, then I guess then we're stuck with it the way that it is. But I really don't think that is the case. But now specifically, having looked at the changes, I think the direction was good. Buffing all the underperforming specs, looking at a couple of inconsistencies of weapons, but not too big of a deal overall. And they're aware of things that are going on with the Pod Tender at least. And also these changes are still subject to change until next week. But like I said, with the tournaments coming up, I don't think we're going to see any massive changes. And based on my assessment of the game, although it is frustrating to die immediately to a set of cooldowns like Combustion or Convoke the Spirits, in a weird way, it's balanced. You have a more diverse pool of at least damage dealing specs than in a long time, in my mind. And it's always kind of shifting as to what people think is really the next broken thing a little bit. So if you were to massively chunk a spec down, you would have to overhaul the game as entirely, basically. Otherwise, that spec just becomes unplayed now. And then if you nerf another spec, that spec becomes unplayed, and you get down to where it's like, oh, there's just two specs that are doing these one-shots on each other, and whoever managed to dodge the getting clipped too much on Twitch and stuff like that is now the strongest spec. So I feel like it might be unlikely that we see changes to PvP specifically until we get to the tournaments, maybe, and then the tournaments will shine a good light on, hey, what's going on? Like, is there good diversity of specs? Is there multiple strategies, or is it just unfolding with one specific playstyle? If it had to be my guess, at the moment, the strongest playstyle is Holy Paladin, Fire Mage, X. So any class in that X spot. As Holy Paladins at the moment have so much uptime with Avenging Wrath on Awakening. They're instant cast healing. They can avoid casting and prevent... You would normally be able to outplay the Paladin by maybe interrupting them or playing around their cooldowns, but their cooldowns are always so persistently active and they never have to cast. So there's no way to outplay them. Their mana is too high, and their mana regeneration on top of this is too high. They're easily the best healer at the moment in my mind. But to nerf them would require a lot of specific tuning towards talents and PvP only. I'm not sure how willing they are to do something like that. In Legion, they would have probably already done a ton of stuff to it, because in Legion we saw a lot of specific PvP tuning knobs utilization. But throughout BFA and then into Shadowlands, it seems like there's a bit of hesitation, at least, towards making a ton of PvP specific changes like that require a lot of tailoring. But Holy Paladin is definitely above and beyond in terms of power. And then I made like a little short list. Probably should have made a bigger list of things that are like specifically hitting really hard. So for Fire Mage, Infernal Cascade, which is a conduit, Controlled Destruction, which is a conduit, these things during combustion are kind of just scaling the damage of Fire Blast and Pyroblast really high to the point where you're just KOing people. There's mastery stacking on top of soulbinds like Pelagos or Nia for the Night Fae and Kyrian, and stacking those all together is causing this huge overwhelming amount of burst damage. Things like Seraphim, which is basically 45-second cooldown, it buffs all of your stats. This is scaling again with the mastery that's provided in a ton from Covenant abilities like Pelagos. And then when you scale those up with Avenging Wrath, it's a similar cooldown stacking situation, right? I don't think this is overly complicated. You just need to look at where the conduits and the talents are coming from. And then having played, I notice where these big spikes come from is when my Omnibar says Seraphim is up. And it's usually only when Seraphim is up that you'll notice this whoa, it's like 100 to 0. Elemental shamans have a similar thing going on with echoing shock, which I didn't list here. So this is a quick thing. And then boom can convoke the spirits. If you get good RNG and it full moons within the first second of ticking, usually a target is immediately deleted. These are generally mechanics, I think, that are just a little bit too over the top. If I had to specifically look at anything, and maybe some minor, I don't know what you do with convoke the spirits, honestly, because it just seems like the ability itself is just, it's either completely everything's dead, or maybe you get unlucky, or someone lined it, or they pop a pet, and I think it should be nerfed. This isn't me trying to say that I don't think it should be nerfed. Some boom can bias. I'm not even playing Convoke, but it's a very complicated ability to address. Things like Zwen, the Tiger for Windwalker, I could have talked about. These are just all the cooldown things stacked together. Right now, Mistweaver and Resto Druid, not so much. Basically, if you're not a Holy Paladin, you're feeling kind of bad at the moment. Shamans are getting better with conduits, and this is also something to note is when classes actually get all their conduits and are playing with all their conduits, and when classes get all their fully upgraded legendaries, proper stat allocation, more equal gear footing, because you may have just fought a fully mythic raid decked up, Convoke the Spirits boomkin that killed you in one hit while you only geared in PvP and were 190 item level. Was it? I mean, Convoke the Spirits is the problem, but I think you can understand my point there, where I don't think we're in a place where we can really identify it, and I am more worried about you cut one spec and it's completely out and then everyone stops playing it. I like this approach that they took with these changes, but I just wanted to list some of the cons that I'm currently seeing with the meta. To me, a redistribution of the damage would be appropriate, and my most eloquent way of phrasing it would be to address all of those cooldowns, like some of the ones that I've listed, nerf them in PvP by an amount. Again, this is just a rough estimate, right? I need to look at numbers to do it specifically. 50% less damage on all cooldowns. Then in PvP, you buff main stat on all classes, agility, intellect, and strength by whatever percent. You've got to pick a percent to figure out where it feels and how good it feels appropriately to see with damage output. And then classes are doing more damage, like something like this, right? Classes are doing more damage outside of their cooldown, so getting crowd control feels impactful and meaningful. Even if you didn't have your combustion up or Lennian interrupt, even though you didn't have your incarn up, you might be able to score a kill. Whereas right now it's just, is combustion up? Yeah, I'm gonna instantly kill that guy. Or yeah, incarn's up, that guy is dead. There's nothing they can do. There's not really anything super engaging about it at the moment from my point of view. I would rather every moment of the game matter a little bit more than just these specific cooldown windows, and that's from my past experience playing the game and what I enjoy in terms of a play style. But I just wanted to note it here. Overall, I think this is a good approach, but I'm curious to see if they do more, and as we get close to the tournaments, I think we'll know for sure. So thank you again very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a comment down below with your thoughts about the changes or what you'd like to see or how the meta is fitting for you. Other than that, please leave a like with the video. Subscribe to the channel if you like this type of content, as I am doing my best to upload as much as possible. And by subscribing, you help me out a lot. It's absolutely free, and it just lets you know when the videos go live. So if you want to see any updates like this, you'll know immediately when they are up. So other than that, thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next video.